Sunlight streamed through the wide windows of JFK Airport, casting a warm glow across the cold stone tiles of the terminal floor. Amid the crowd moving back and forth, no one paid attention to the man walking with a calm, confident stride, as if each of his steps followed a rhythm unbothered by the rush of the world around him. Jonathan Reed, CEO of a sustainable food production company, was heading toward the boarding gate, his right hand holding a first-class boarding pass, his left hand carrying a fine leather bag with a neatly folded suit inside. He was on his way to San Francisco to attend a sustainable food development conference, where he would be the keynote speaker. At 58 years old, Jonathan was no stranger to this routine. An early morning at the airport, the fresh stillness of waiting, purposeful footsteps, and nothing to distract him but the work ahead. He was a man of quiet humility, never seeking too much attention. Yet today felt different. As he approached the boarding pass check at Gate 17, the eyes of Lily, the young staff member working there, lingered on him with a look that was not quite usual. She paused briefly, then looked at him more closely. It wasn't outright surprise or confusion, but rather a glance filled with doubt, as if she were silently wondering whether he truly belonged here, whether he truly deserved a seat in first class. Jonathan, ever composed, handed her the boarding pass. There was nothing unusual about it. His name was clearly printed and nothing suggested it was fake, but Lily didn't scan it right away. She looked at him a little longer, as though waiting for something. Then, holding the pass, she turned to a colleague nearby and whispered something Jonathan couldn't hear. Everything unfolded in silence. No one spoke, but an odd feeling began to settle. People nearby started to take notice. No one said anything aloud, but their curious glances turned toward him, filling the air with an unspoken discomfort. Jonathan stood still. No rushing, no reaction. He knew what was happening. It wasn't the employee's behavior or the delay in the process that concerned him. It was the quiet form of prejudice, the subtle judgment, the kind people often feel when they don't fit the image others expect. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. But he also knew this wasn't going to pass as just a small incident. And when his phone rang in the stillness of the terminal, he knew this was the moment to turn a negative experience into a chance for change. Not just for himself, but for everyone witnessing. What was about to happen? Jonathan only needed to make one phone call, and everything would change. The heaviness in the air seemed to grow thicker by the minute. The glances from nearby passengers became more curious. No one said anything, but everyone sensed something unusual was happening. Lily, the boarding pass checker, finally turned to look at Jonathan again. There was hesitation in her eyes. She brought her mic closer to her mouth and quietly spoke to a colleague. Jonathan didn't rush to respond. He stood still, holding the boarding pass firmly, showing no sign of irritation. He had experienced this kind of prejudice before, but this time it was unfolding in front of a crowd. A few people began whispering about the delay. Some looked at Jonathan with suspicion, but no one dared speak up. Meanwhile, Lily kept hesitating, unsure of what to do next. She stared at the boarding pass in her hand as though it were more than just a routine task, as if it had become a problem she didn't know how to solve. Eventually, she asked Jonathan to present an additional ID, even though no policy required it. With his usual calmness, Jonathan pulled out his wallet and handed over his government-issued ID. Lily took it awkwardly and placed it on the desk without really looking at it. "Please wait a moment," she said, her voice still uncertain. Jonathan said nothing. He simply waited, trusting that the situation would unfold in time. Moments later, a uniformed security officer appeared. She stood silently next to Jonathan, her eyes scanning him coldly, evaluating him as if he were a potential threat. Jonathan immediately understood. She wasn't reacting to anything he had done. She was simply reacting to a system, one that had taught her, consciously or not, to see people like him as out of place. To them, Jonathan didn't look like someone who should be here, even though he was a first-class passenger with a valid boarding pass. Everything felt frozen in that moment. Jonathan remained calm, expression unchanged, standing firm. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he also knew that if he let this continue without resistance, he would be silently agreeing with the prejudice and injustice taking place. With the officer still beside him, Jonathan reached into his pocket and took out his phone. He began a call, one he knew would change everything. There was no need for shouting or confrontation. Just one call. He needed Maggie, his assistant, to prepare something important, a $48 million contract between his company and the airline, the very key that could shift the situation. He didn't want to escalate things, but he also refused to accept being treated this way because of someone else's quiet bias. The call was brief, but enough for Maggie to understand the urgency. Jonathan didn't need to explain much. She knew exactly what he needed. She immediately began her work and promised to update him shortly. Jonathan didn't rush. He didn't get angry. He simply stood there waiting, letting things move forward the way he believed they should. The way people looked at him began to change. Some of the passengers were starting to see that something wasn't right. The tension continued to rise, but Jonathan remained still. He knew he was up against a deeply rooted system, and that sometimes real change only comes from calm, patient action. Things would soon be resolved. The next few moments stretched endlessly. The air around seemed heavier, as if everyone at the airport was waiting for something to happen. Jonathan stood still, no rush, no expression on his face, just the calm composure he had mastered over the years. Passengers nearby began to sense that something was off, and tension rose. But Jonathan held his ground. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to make noise. All he needed was to let silence do its work. Maggie, his assistant, stayed in contact. After a few minutes of waiting, Jonathan's phone rang. He pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the screen. It was Maggie. He answered calmly, voice steady. "Maggie, how's it going?" Jonathan asked, not a hint of worry in his tone. "I've reached out to Horizon Air's legal department. They're looking into the situation." "Do you want me to contact the senior executives?" Maggie asked, her voice firm but composed. Jonathan looked at the phone screen for a long moment. He didn't need loud backup or to create a scandal. He knew the issue would become clear once people realized the problem wasn't him, it was the system. He nodded gently. "It's enough that they understand what's wrong." He put the phone away and turned back toward the gate. The people around him started paying closer attention. Some turned their backs slightly. Glancing his way, they were beginning to realize that something wasn't right, that this injustice wasn't just about one man, but part of something bigger. Lily, the boarding pass checker, felt uneasy. She stood quietly for a moment, unsure what to do next. She looked at Jonathan, then turned to a colleague as if waiting for instruction. The crowd murmured about the delay, and a man in a tracksuit stepped forward and asked, "Lily, what's going on?" "Why aren't we boarding?" Lily answered awkwardly. "We're handling a small issue." But Jonathan knew her hesitation wasn't about policy. It was because she realized this had gone beyond routine. Just then, a woman in a red suit appeared. Cynthia Reyes, Regional Director of Horizon Air. She walked briskly toward the gate. She didn't need to ask who was causing the delay. She'd heard enough over the phone. The moment she saw Jonathan, she knew this was something the company couldn't allow to continue. She looked at him without defensiveness or embarrassment. She understood this wasn't just about one flight. It was about the system, about how they treated valued customers with the respect they deserved. Cynthia approached and extended her hand carefully. "Mr. Reed, I'm Cynthia Reyes, Regional Director for Horizon Air. I sincerely apologize for what happened, and I'll get to the bottom of this immediately." Jonathan didn't rush to shake her hand. He simply nodded gently. "Thank you, but I'm not here for an apology. What I want is action. I signed a $48 million contract with your company, and I need to know why I was treated this way. Just because I don't look like the image someone had in mind." Cynthia was quiet, unsure of what to say. She knew an apology wouldn't erase what had already happened. She looked at Lily, then back at Jonathan, fully aware that he wasn't the first person to be treated like this, and he wouldn't be the last. She realized this wasn't just a personal error. It was a hard lesson in how people can be overlooked or misjudged because of hidden biases. The silence lingered for a few seconds, but Jonathan remained composed and patient. All he wanted was something simple: recognition and real change from those in power within the system. Cynthia didn't rush to offer another apology, but her presence alone brought a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The staff began exchanging glances, and the confidence they had earlier was no longer there. The reason was simple. They realized that Dorian Reed, the man they had just denied boarding, wasn't just a first-class passenger. He was a key figure in a $48 million contract that Horizon Air had recently signed. They couldn't deny his importance, but their actions had told a very different story. Cynthia extended her hand, offering a small smile, though the tension was still clear on her face. "Mr. Reed, I'm sorry for this inconvenience. We will be reviewing all procedures and employee behavior related to this situation. I will personally make sure this doesn't happen again." Jonathan looked at her calmly, not in a hurry. He knew that apologies were not enough. What he needed was real change, and he didn't have to raise his voice or make threats to get it. "I'm not asking for an apology, Ms. Reyes," he said, his voice steady, each word carrying quiet strength. "What I need is a commitment that your staff will be trained to treat every customer with fairness. That's more important than any apology." Cynthia nodded, her face filled with concern. "We'll begin immediately. I promise you this will be investigated and necessary changes will be made." Jonathan said nothing more. He glanced at Lily, who stood quietly in the corner, her arms at her sides. Her face completely changed now, filled with visible unease and worry. Dorian looked at her, not with anger, but with clear disappointment. He didn't need to say anything. She understood what she had done, and it was a lesson she would never forget. Silence filled the space. The people around them began to realize that this wasn't just a personal incident. It was a wake-up call about the quiet forms of bias that often go unnoticed. As they watched Jonathan remain calm and composed, they began to see that sometimes true change doesn't come from shouting or noise. It comes from actions rooted in quiet strength. Cynthia and her assistants quickly left to coordinate with the relevant departments. They informed senior leadership about what had happened and began reviewing staff training protocols. Everything seemed to be handled quietly, but Jonathan knew that within those who had witnessed it, a deep shift was already taking place. Not long after, another Horizon Air staff member, likely the shift supervisor, stepped forward, bowed slightly, and said, "We've received word from the executive team. Please accept our apologies for what happened. If there's anything else we can do, let us know." Jonathan gave a small smile. "Nothing grand. Thank you. What I truly want is for everyone to understand that the most important thing is respect. That's something I always emphasize in my work, and I hope Horizon Air will do the same." Change didn't come from big speeches, but from Jonathan's way of handling the situation, his calmness in the face of challenge. He knew it was his patience and integrity that made the real difference, not just within the company, but in the hearts of those who watched. In the end, with the support of Cynthia and Horizon Air's leadership, Jonathan was allowed to board the plane without any further issue. He walked into the first-class cabin not for compensation or apologies, but because he had already achieved what he came for. Not just an external correction, but a shift in perception and behavior among those around him. Now he could continue his journey with peace of mind, while others were left to reflect on how they view and treat the people around them. Jonathan sat in his first-class seat, the soft light from the airplane window casting a gentle glow across his face. A sense of peace settled over him, not because of the comfort of the flight or the privilege of where he was sitting, but because he knew his actions had brought about a small but meaningful change. Outside, the clouds slowly drifted away, and the sky grew brighter as the plane soared through the air, rising above the distant skyline of New York. Jonathan leaned back in his seat, gently moving his leather bag to the side, his thoughts quietly flowing through his mind. He didn't need to speak up to make a statement. He didn't need the world to buzz with attention. All he needed was to stay true to himself and act in a way he knew could make a difference. The phone call he made at the boarding gate didn't just solve his own problem. It sparked a shift in how Horizon Air, and perhaps others in the industry, viewed racism and unconscious bias. He wasn't looking for compensation or recognition. What he wanted was real internal change. And that's what he achieved. As the plane climbed higher, he realized something important. True change doesn't always come from loud voices or dramatic moments. Sometimes it comes from quiet, steady actions filled with purpose. Each of us has the power to create change, not by making noise, but by standing firm in our values and taking action, even when no one is watching. Horizon Air later launched an internal investigation and introduced new measures to improve their procedures. They organized training sessions on cultural awareness and racial bias for all staff, especially those working at boarding gates and in airports. The people who had been at Gate 17 that day never forgot the lesson they had learned. Never let prejudice cloud your judgment or determine someone else's fate. Cynthia Reyes and Horizon Air's senior leadership understood that this wasn't just a minor incident. It was a wake-up call for how they needed to treat every customer with fairness and dignity, no matter where they came from or who they were. They knew the company had to do better, and they made a commitment to make sure this would never happen again. When Jonathan arrived in San Francisco and stepped onto the stage at the Sustainable Food Development Conference, he was warmly welcomed. No one mentioned the airport incident. No one needed to. But deep inside, he knew that quiet moment when he stood calmly and waited was what truly mattered. His actions hadn't just changed how one airline saw things. They had opened a larger conversation about fairness and respect in society. What happened at JFK Airport wasn't just a story about racial bias. It was a story about quiet leadership, about using calm to confront injustice, and about how each of us can create change, even the small kind, with powerful ripple effects. Jonathan Reed didn't need to make a scene. He only needed to do what he believed was right, and that's how he changed the world around him, even if just a little. 1 year later, stories about Jonathan, about how he faced discrimination and stayed true to his values, were still being shared at conferences and in conversations about leadership and equity. No one could forget the image of Jonathan standing quietly at Gate 17, phone in hand, while an entire airport paused in anticipation of a bigger change. In the end, those stories changed the way people thought about power. Not the kind of power that shouts, but the kind that moves silently with patience, with quiet strength, and with a leadership that doesn't have to speak to be heard.